let's begin our question and answer session. We have the first participant from the Universidad Tecnológico de Nezahualcóyotl, UTN, Estado de Mexico, Mexico. The question is, Mr. Hopwood, you mentioned more than once that the concentration of influencers can play a critical role in the successful deployment of an idea. What do you mean by concentration?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is some logic to having a proper number of folks who can influence the progression of idea throughout its entire life cycle. It's less easily understood where those influencers should physically be related to that person with the idea. Certainly, technology shrinks the globe when trying to consolidate influencers, say to provide feedback, some counsel, and some information sharing on an idea. When an idea is ready to go, and especially considering early adoption, I think there are many advantages to having a concentration of influencers within a close proximity. That concentration will help assure that many others see the idea in motion. They'll take cues from the early adopters, the influencers, if you will, and then assist in moving that idea further and further out. I think it's much harder to have an idea adopted and spread when those you rely upon to be influencers are widely dispersed.
Thank you. We have a second participant from Tianjin College of Commerce, TCC, in Tianjin, China. The question is, discontinuity is a complex subject relative to organizations and social structures. Why is that concept important to today's dialogue?
This issue of discontinuity comes up a lot, and I noted in one part of the talk that we might consider change as an agent of discontinuity. We hear that all the time, don't we? Change is hard. I can't deal with it. It's too much, and similar things. But from that perspective, it's critical to be able to recognize when there are challenges to continuity. Change may be one, as might be other external factors, such as someone else's great idea that is nearing the adoption phase that might challenge one of your own. On the other hand, much like the wind to a tree, some dynamics that might result in some level of discontinuity may actually prove beneficial by organically or otherwise making us a little stronger.
Thank you. We have another participant from Escomex Escuela de Negocios Mexicali, Baja California, Mexico. The question is, you noted more than once that change can strengthen an organization. Does change then eliminate the concerns of discontinuity, or does change make it worse?
Well-structured question. I appreciate that. Change can strengthen an organization, much like I mentioned during the course of my talk. But change does not lessen our need to identify and focus on those factors that may stimulate discontinuity or hasten its magnitude. To that end, change rarely immediately makes something better or worse. Think of the Anasazi example. It took generations for that change to finally see a unique and once thriving population abandon their ancestral homes in the American Southwest. Perhaps had they been a little better at recognizing the changes, they could have made some subtle shifts in their response, and it wouldn't have been an all or nothing game.
Thank you. Our next participant is from Universidad Técnica de Comercialización de Desarrollo, UTCD, Asunción, Paraguay. The question is, does the example you used in your talk about hush puppy shoes truly define what we've been referring to as mass adoption of an idea?
I think in large part it does. it also demonstrated that for an idea to take wings, giant populations of adopters were not necessary. Think about it. A few early adopters, or influencers, if you will, began wearing the shoes. Other influential folks then followed suit, and these were the models and the designers I spoke of, who were followed by the fashionista, who in their articles and pictures began to further influence providers and ultimately the buyers of those shoes. This is a great example of Shui and the co-authors of his research and their work, where they described as few as 10% of a population may be sufficient to make an idea flourish.
Our next participant is from Comisión Federal de Electricidad, CFE, Subdirección de Generación in Mexico City, Mexico. The question is, I was interested in your discussion of the potato famine. That storyline held many corollaries: change, business, idea adoption, and others. Is one more important than the other?
The easy answer to that is no. The potato famine is that all-inclusive story. Had one major element that we discussed changed, the famine might not have occurred, or at least it might have been a little less catastrophic. Someone had the idea to take potatoes to a hungry nation, an idea with merit, where using certain farming techniques, their growth safely flourished. For business and population dynamic reasons, a change was implemented. It was adopted, and adopted by a small percentage of that population. This, in essence, allowed an invasive species, that one I talked about, P. infestans, to flourish. But for the elimination of the Huacho style of farming, the one that came over from Peru, Ireland likely would not have had the mass exodus and death rates that it did.
Our next question is from Consejo Nacional de Normalización de Certificación de Competencias Laborales, Conocer, Mexico City, Mexico. The question is, you talked about the challenges of innovation and one centered on the limitations of modeling. Can there really be too much modeling?
You know, as a businessman and sometimes academic, I do think there can be too much modeling or too much analysis. That's why I briefly touched on decision-making in the second half of my talk. There's strength to intuition, that gut feeling, if you will, that something might be right or worthy of a push. Experience, of course, sharpens the intuition blade, making it more effective. I think perhaps coupled with the appropriate level of modeling and analysis, we can make better decisions yet. I suppose in the big world, simply relying on one over the other is not the best path to take. My point was this: we can rely too much on modeling and analysis, and in many cases it slows the idea process to the point where you lose interest, and that is those that might be early adopters lose interest and they don't help you migrate your idea forward.
Dan, it strikes me that the adoption of many innovations face a barrier in that they may be overly complex for a person to adopt a new idea. This is often the case with older generations and technologies. How do you overcome that barrier to make something at least seem simple enough to adopt?
Thanks for that, Peter. There are some complexities in your question. So simplicity versus complexity, I think, has to sort of bridge several things. One is, we talk about culture, your idea of young generations versus older generations. There's a cultural dynamic there. I've had the opportunity to see some of the stuff that Google is working on. To use a paraphrase, it's mind-blowing stuff. So if the question is, are ideas that are simpler do better, they may be more quickly adopted in some realms. Right. Ideas that are complex oftentimes require us to overcome the dynamics I talked about, such as cost, analysis and those types of things. So if we bridge each of some of the dynamics that I talked about with understanding culture, understanding time, and the concentration and proximity of adopters, I think we can sort of shrink that simplistic, complex dialogue and make things move along.
Good.